the gap between the way things are and the way they could be has widened, in that the potential has risen even faster than the actual mean benefits that people experience. And I think this is an ethical indictment that we could provide a much better world just by better deploying the techniques we have.
This is Heja Framtiden, the Swedish podcast on the future, and I'm sitting here at Fritanke Förlag in Stockholm together with astronomer royal Martin Rees. Welcome to the show.
Good to be on the show.
I'm just going to begin by asking you a fundamental question with regards to your book, which is called On the Future, Om Framtiden. Why is this century, why is the 21st century so important for humanity, you think?
I think there are two reasons why it really is special this century. The first is that the number of people on the world and the capacity they have to use resources is for the first time having an effect on the global environment. We're changing the climate, we're changing the plant coverage and animal coverage in the planet. So it's the first century when human beings, one species, can actually affect the future of the planet. That's one thing. And the second is that technology is advancing so fast that even a few people can have an effect that cascades globally. And also we have the potential to change human beings themselves by bio techniques, genetic modification, and also by cyber techniques. So we have the possibility to change the Earth and to change our species. And that's never been true in previous centuries.
And that's called the Anthropocene.
Yes, the definition of Anthropocene is a bit vague, but certainly we're deep in it now.
Okay. So there seems to be, not only with you, but many of the interviews I've had, there seems to be a large frustration that we know everything is there, we have the resources, but we can't really act on it to solve the big problems we have in the world. Is that correct description of...
I think it's certainly the case that it's very hard to get global action on issues like climate change and environment preservation. And the reason for that is that these issues are long-term and they are multinational. And, of course, most politicians tend to focus on the short-term and the local, and this is an inherent problem. It's very hard to get a politician now to prioritise something where the benefits will accrue to distant parts of the world a few decades from hence. So my personal view is that the only way we can get priority given to these questions is if we raise public concern, because the politicians do care about what is in their inboxes and what's in the press. And if we think back to earlier great causes, anti-slavery, civil rights, gay rights, for instance, they've all started with a few individuals and they've gradually gained support, and the public then takes them up and the politicians have to follow. And let me give you two examples which have been encouraging in recent years. One is that the Pope put out an encyclical in 2015, which was the first clear statement by a Pope that humans have a duty to the rest of the environment and that climate change was a threat. And the Pope got a standing ovation at the UN, and he's got 1 billion followers in Latin America, Africa and East Asia, and that had a big effect on easing the consensus at the Paris conference in December 2015. That's one example. As another example, more recently, which is perhaps focused on my own country, the UK, is that there's now legislation to ban non-reusable drinking straws and plastic bags and all that. And this wouldn't have been on the agenda had it not been for the influence of David Attenborough's TV programmes Blue Planet, which showed the effect of plastics in the ocean, and in particular showed a picture of an albatross returning from its wanderings and regurgitating for its young not the hoped-for food, but some bits of plastic. And that's an iconic image, rather like the polar bear on the melting ice floe. And that got through to the public, and certainly a British politician would not have prioritised dealing with ocean plastics had it not been for the public concern, which was amplified by David Attenborough. So it's these charismatic individuals and these images which make the public care about long-term global questions.
Now we have the Swedish young girl, Greta Thunberg.
Yes, well, I think we have to cheer that on, because that's getting a global resonance. And, of course, young people will still be alive at the end of a century. And this accentuates a point I made in my talk here yesterday, that the discount rate is appropriate. And many of the people who downplay the importance of dealing with climate and environmental issues do so because they apply a standard economic 5% discount rate, which you would apply if you're deciding whether it's worth putting up a new office building or something. And that's not right in this context. You should value the lifetime benefits of a baby born today as much as that of someone now middle-aged today. And that means you should be prepared to make sacrifices for the benefit of those at the end of a century, and to remove a risk from those who will still be alive at the end of a century. There's some win-win strategies. I mentioned in my book that to enhance the rate of research and development into clean energy is something we should do, because that's going to bring down the cost of clean energy and lead to more efficient types of clean energy and its appurtenances. And that'll, for instance, mean that India, which doesn't have a proper electricity grid, will be able to leapfrog directly to carbon-free energy and won't need to build coal-fired power stations, which they would otherwise.
Yeah, I think a common, perhaps a misconception, is that many of the poor countries will try to live exactly as we did in the 80s and 90s. But I think many of these countries will jump one step
Well, they've got
ahead.
to be able to, and they can as long as it's cheap. The trouble is that at the moment, most of these clean energy generations are more expensive than coal-fired power stations. So we've got to ensure that they're more efficient and cheaper. And then, of course, as you say, they can leapfrog, just like they have not had landline telephones. They've leapfrogged directly to mobile phones.
Yeah, and surpassed the banking system directly into mobile transactions. I mean, many people know that we need to make these systemic changes in energy, and education, finance, healthcare, etc. And you make a strong case in your book for research and science. Do you think we should prioritize even more science and research? And you also seem to encourage scientists to step up and take responsibility for actually spreading the word as well.
Yes, well, there's two separate things. I mean, I think it's clear if we look back that our present world is, for most people, a better world to live in than the world of the 19th century or earlier times, and that is due to the applications of science, electricity, etc., and all those things discovered by scientists, and all the ways in which we are more healthy than we were 100 years ago. So I think everyone agrees that it's through the applications of science that we are able to feed and keep healthy a population of 7.5 billion people on this planet. And so clearly we need to foster scientific research. But of course the way science is applied is not a matter just for the scientists themselves, because the scientists are experts in a narrow area, but they have no special standing on the ethical issues or the economic or political issues, which are relevant to the way their work's applied. They have an obligation, I think, to inform the public and also inform politicians of the risks of what they're doing, and also to do all they can to promote beneficial applications. But it's got to be the politicians and the wider public that decide. And that's why not only do we need to ensure that there are competent people doing science so that we can maintain the great traditions of science, particularly here in Europe, but also there needs to be a reasonable level of public education in science, so that people aren't bamboozled by bogus arguments so easily and by false statistics. And so, because so many of the issues now which politicians have to address are in energy, health or environment, when some science is relevant, people need to have a feel for those issues.
You mentioned that with climate change we need some kind of global collaboration, which is difficult to get going, but we still need it. But when it comes to space travel and space exploration, you don't believe in nation states taking a role in that. You think we should encourage private actors. Why do you say that?
Well, I mean, there's some aspects of space that need to be regulated, just like for aviation. But I think when we focused on manned spaceflight in particular, the situation is different, because manned spaceflight, of course, was pioneered for national prestige purposes by the United States and Russia. And it had some practical benefits, of course, to be able to service this Hubble Space Telescope and things like that. But now with the advance of robots, the practical case for people in space is getting weaker. And so I don't think one can justify on any practical grounds sending people into space, because we can have robotic fabricators and intelligent robots to probe the surface of Mars just as well as a human geologist in the future. So I personally think that the only case for space, for manned space flight, is as a sort of adventure and exploration. And that should be done by the private sector. And that's primarily because the private sector can cut costs and take higher risks. If we think of the American space program, it sent people to the moon, of course, a wonderful achievement. But since that time, it's been sending people into low Earth orbit in the space station, and it launched the space shuttle 135 times. There were 2 failures. Each of those was a big trauma in the United States and held up the program for 3 years, etc. But that's less than a 2% failure rate. And test pilots and the kind of people who do hang gliding and climb mountains, they're prepared to take that sort of risk. And so I think that manned spaceflight should be left to the private sector, which can overtly accept the kind of risks that would be taken by these adventurers. And I think that's the way to do it. And I hope that this does succeed, because I think we should cheer on these adventurers and hope that there will be some pioneers living on Mars by the end of a century. And I think that's important, because they will be able to use all the techniques we'll then have for genetic modification and maybe cyborg modification to adapt themselves to the hostile environment of Mars. And I think they will be, in a sense, the first post-humans, because they will evolve almost into different species and then maybe go off further into space. And here on Earth, I think we're going to need to heavily regulate the use of these new technologies on ethical grounds and prudential grounds. But those adventures on Mars will be away from all the regulators, and they have an incentive. So good luck to them.
Do you think it's practically possible to make such a differentiation between those two? I mean, isn't the post-human development a part of our evolution as a species?
No, I mean, the point is that Darwinian evolution is very slow, and it doesn't apply to humans anymore anyway. But this evolution by design could happen on a timescale 1,000 times faster than Darwinian evolution ever did. And so it could be quite possible that within a few hundred years there could be, on Mars, species which look very different from humans. Maybe they'll be electronic, maybe they will be flesh and blood, but very different. So this can happen, and there will be the possibility to, by the end of a century, not only maybe link our brains to something electronic, but also to redesign the entire genome. And I'm saying that we will have that technology, but I think we should not use it on Earth. We should regulate it. And of course we had no incentive, because we're quite well adapted to living on the Earth, whereas they're badly adapted to living on Mars.
Yeah, but I think my question is it possible to regulate it?
Well, I mean, I think that's the problem, because one of my worries about all these new technologies, bio and cyber, is that they allow a small group or even an individual to do something which could cascade globally. We already know what cyber attacks can do, and biotech is something which needs fairly small, widely available equipment, and that could allow people by error or by design to release some dangerous pathogen. So I do worry very much about that, and I worry that the regulations can't be enforced globally any more than the tax laws or the drug laws can. So that is, I think, one of the biggest worries. That's one of my main grounds for pessimism about getting smoothly through this century, because I think it'll be very, very hard to have the trade-off between privacy, liberty and security, given that we have this new element that even a few people are empowered to do something which in our interconnected world can cascade globally. So I think that's going to be a problem. But I think we will want to try and regulate these techniques. And as I say, the incentive to use some of them is less here on Earth than it would be for someone living in a hostile environment.
You also mentioned yesterday that we've been lagging behind on ethics and ethical questions. Mm-hmm. Do you think we should step up the ethical discussions again?
Well, we certainly should, and of course there's a huge gap between the way things are and the way they could and should be, and this is something which we need to become aware of, and this is another of my reasons for not being very optimistic. In fact, in my book, my main theme is to be a technical optimist, in that we could provide a good world in 2100 using technology to provide food, energy, and communication and everything. But whether that will happen or whether we will end up with a violent world with huge inequalities between, say, Africa and other countries, we don't know. And I worry that even though it's true that the average conditions of life are better now than they were in the past, if you were to choose a random time to be alive, you'd probably, despite all its problems, choose the present rather than any earlier generations. The gap between the way things are and the way they could be has widened, in that the potential has risen even faster than the actual mean benefits that people experience. And I think this is an ethical indictment, that we could provide a much better world just by better deploying the techniques we have. We don't need new technology. We just need to redeploy. And some of that will happen as a consequence of AI taking over certain kinds of work, etc. But we've got to redeploy the money so that we provide jobs for people where human qualities are needed, like carers for young and old, and also make sure that countries in Africa benefit, because it's a deplorable situation that the 2,000 richest people in the world could, if they wished, double the income of the billion poorest people in the world.
What's your best tip for making the world a better place in the future?
I think we need to prioritize clean energy research, and also research into technologies like artificial meat and other ways of growing food, to make sure that even if the population rises to 9 billion by mid-century, everyone can be properly fed. And we need to propagandize for these technologies. We also, I think, need to ensure that we have charismatic figures who spread the word, so that the public is concerned, and politicians therefore are pressured to take the actions which benefit not just their constituents in the short run, but are benign for the point of view of the world in the longer term.
Do you have a reading tip besides your own book?
It would be invidious to select any book.
Okay. Who do you think I should interview?
Yes. Oh, well, I mean, one person, yes. My colleague, who's the chair of our Centre for Rees, Sir Partha Dasgupta. He's one of the world's leading development economists. He's won the Blue Planet Prize and the Tyler Prize, etc. And he's done a lot on population ethics.
Okay.
And why it matters that we should not have a rising population, because there are negative externalities of having extra children, etc. And he's written very thoughtfully about this. And I mentioned it a bit in my book, but I've learnt a lot from him. And he's a very charismatic person himself.
Okay, great.
So I'd certainly recommend him.
Thank you so much, Martin Rees, for joining us at Heja Framtiden.
Well, thank you for having me on your program.
Check out Martin Rees's book On the Future, Om Framtiden, in Swedish at Fritanke förlag. Thank you so much for listening. Bye-bye.
Mm-hmm.